In November 1883, on the Dakota Prairie, while every other family stacked cordwood and packed rags around window frames, Amanda Whitfield sewed thick quilted curtains and hung them over every pane. Townsfolk called it window bedding and laughed, but she kept layering calico and wool as if fabric could block the freeze. What did she know they did? And when the merciless cold arrived, would those humble quilts save her family or become their tomb? Her name was Amanda Whitfield, a widow of 29, raising a 10-year-old son alone in a single-room homestead 20 miles from the nearest doctor. The winter of 1883 had already killed a man in Marshall County who'd simply run out of fuel between dawn and noon. Everyone in town prepared the same way: more wood, more rags, more prayer. Nobody believed a woman's stitched curtains could matter against a Dakota freeze that split iron nails. But Amanda wasn't just sewing. She was solving a problem the men hadn't even noticed yet, and the coming storm would reveal what she already knew. Amanda Whitfield had learned the danger of frost the winter after her husband's death, when she'd woken to find a thin sheet of ice coating the inside of the bedroom window, as if the cold had grown teeth and bitten through the glass itself. That same morning, she'd noticed the only pane that stayed clear was the one where she'd pinned a half-finished quilt against the night draft because the wooden shutter had warped and left a gap. It wasn't skill that placed it there. It was desperation. But the frost hadn't formed, and the difference stuck in her mind like a splinter she couldn't remove. The following year, while other homesteaders in Marshall County loaded their window frames with straw and nailed rags over the sashes, Amanda began sewing with a purpose no one else could see. She scavenged worn calico scraps from the general store in Elm Creek, trading eggs for salvaged wool batting and torn cotton sheets. Horace Peck, who owned the store, would slide the bolts of fabric across the counter and snort. Window bedding, he called it, loud enough for the other customers to hear. Woman's going to freeze to death with a needle in her hand. But Amanda kept stitching. She sewed 3 layers tight together: a dark outer calico to absorb what little sun the winter offered, a thick middle of carded wool, and a muslin backing that trapped the dead air against the glass. Then she added a row of bone buttons along the top hem so each quilt could hang snug against the frame, sealing the pane like a closed door. She had no formal education in science, no books on thermodynamics, but she understood something that the men chopping cordwood outside town ignored. Cold moved through glass like water through a cracked bucket, and the only way to slow it was to break the current. Caleb, her 10-year-old son, thought the quilts were strange at first. He missed the pale winter light that used to pour through the bare windows even when the frost turned it milky. But he helped her anyway, standing on a stool to button the top row while she pressed the wool tight against the glass. He'd been sick the previous winter with a cough that lasted 6 weeks, and she refused to let that happen again. She'd lost enough. Her husband, John, had died the autumn before last when a wagon wheel shattered on frozen ground and threw him against a stone wall. The same cold that killed him now waited outside the door, patient and hungry. By the middle of December, the first hard freeze had gripped the basin. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. In town, every window bloomed with fern-like ice from the inside, spreading across the glass until the sun became a pale suggestion. Families woke to find their water buckets frozen solid beside the stove. And one morning, an old farmer named Silas Dunn was found dead in his chair beside a window thick with frost, his breath having joined the ice while he slept. The air in his cabin had been so cold that the frost crept across his beard before his body stiffened. That story traveled fast. Nothing made people in Marshall County feel safe like a roaring fire and a heavy wooden bar across the door. So when Amanda Whitfield began nailing her quilted covers over every window in her small cabin, people didn't see insulation. They saw a woman blocking her own light, sealing herself into a dark box with a child who already looked too thin. Margaret Holcomb, whose husband owned the livery, came by one afternoon with a basket of stale bread and a warning wrapped in neighborly concern. "A dark house invites sickness," she said, eyeing the quilted windows. "A body needs fresh air, Mandy. You'll smother your boy in here." Amanda thanked her for the bread and kept working. but she wasn't sealing the cabin completely. What the neighbors didn't see was the small gap she'd left at the bottom of each quilt, a finger-width space where the muslin didn't quite reach the sill. It allowed just enough air to keep the stove draft pulling and the candle flames from starving. She discovered the balance accidentally one night when she'd buttoned a quilt too tight and noticed the lamp burning low and blue. The next morning, she'd adjusted every panel. She was watching, learning, adapting, treating her home like a living thing that needed to breathe but not bleed warmth. Word of the curtained cabin reached Gideon Shale, a retired trapper who had wintered in the northern Rockies and carried more knowledge about cold than any man in the county. He came by one afternoon as sleet began to fall, his old mule standing patient in the yard. He didn't laugh. He didn't warn about dark rooms. He simply examined the window quilts with the same quiet attention he once given to frozen rivers and dangerous passes. He pressed his palm against the wool, then against the bare wall beside it, and held the two temperatures in his mind. Then he looked at Amanda with something closer to confusion than admiration. "Inside of this fabric feels warmer than the wood beside it," he said. "How'd you manage that?" Amanda showed him the wool batting, the double stitching, the way the calico faced outward to catch the sun. Gideon nodded slowly, then said nothing more. But he left without mocking her, and that silence was louder than any laugh. As Christmas approached, the weather turned violent. A howling wind swept down from the Canadian plains, driving the temperature so low that tree sap froze inside the trunks, splitting them open with cracks like gunshots. The town boarded up tight. The school closed. Fires burned day and night, and still the frost grew thick as quarter-inch glass on the inside of windows across the county. Everywhere except the Whitfield cabin, people began to notice. Horace Peck heard it from a farmer who'd passed the homestead and seen candlelight glowing through a window quilt, the pane underneath almost perfectly clear. "Lucky," Horace said. "That's all." But Amanda knew luck had nothing to do with it. She spent the last 2 months sewing not just for herself, but for anyone who would listen. She'd shown the women at the Sunday sewing circle how to quilt a window cover, how to layer wool and calico, how to leave the small breath gap at the sill. A few began copying her quietly, while their husbands dismissed the work as women's busy hands. The frost in those homes began to retreat. Still, the real test hadn't come yet. The old settlers in Marshall County spoke of a blizzard that had buried the entire region in 1868. A storm so fierce that survivors found frozen cattle standing upright beneath the drifts, perfectly preserved by the sudden cold. Some said it would come again, and the weather signs that winter were the same. A dry autumn, a warm spell in early January, and then a silence in the wind that made the hair on a person's neck rise. On the evening of January 12th, the silence arrived. The wind died. The sky turned a color that had no name, and Amanda stood at her cabin door, watching the horizon, knowing what was coming. She had 6 window quilts, enough wood for 4 days, and a son who was already coughing again. The storm would prove whether her needlework could hold back a cold that had killed stronger men than her. But there was something else she hadn't considered, something that no one had warned her about, because no one had ever believed her window quilts would work well enough to cause a new kind of danger. The blizzard hit at midnight. Wind slammed against the cabin like a falling tree, and the temperature dropped 60 degrees in under an hour. Inside, Amanda and Caleb huddled near the stove while the lamps flickered. The window quilts bulged inward slightly with each gust, but the buttons held. For the first 2 hours, the cabin stayed warmer than it had any right to. The frost on the glass never formed. Caleb's cough quieted. Amanda began to believe. Then she noticed the candle flame. It had turned blue, almost invisible, and was bending toward the ceiling in a lazy, unsteady spiral. She watched it for a full minute, feeling a pressure building in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. Her head began to ache. Caleb's breathing grew shallow and fast, and when she touched his cheek, his skin was clammy despite the warmth. The air inside the cabin had grown thick, used up, and the small breath gaps she'd left in the quilts were no longer enough. The blizzard had packed snow against the outer walls, sealing those gaps from the outside, turning her home into a closed box. The very window quilts that had stopped the cold were now trapping the stove fumes and their own spent breath inside with them. Amanda stared at the nearest window quilt, knowing that if she cut it open, the cold would flood in and the frost would win. If she didn't, the air would slowly poison them both. Outside, the storm screamed on, and inside, the blue flame grew fainter. She reached for the sewing scissors. The scissors felt heavy in her hand, cold metal biting into her palm as the blue flame shrank to a ghost of itself. Amanda could hear her own pulse in her ears, louder than the storm hammering outside. Caleb's breathing had turned shallow, each exhale a soft whimper. She had maybe 2 minutes before the air became too thin for either of them. But slicing open, a quilt would surrender the warmth she'd fought to preserve. She knelt at the window nearest the bed, chose a seam where she'd double-stitched the calico, and cut a slit no wider than her thumb. The fabric parted with a low ripping sound, and a needle of frigid air shot into the room, carrying the sharp scent of snow and pine. The candle flame flickered violently, then steadied, its color shifting from ghost blue back to pale yellow. Amanda pushed her face near the opening, feeling the cold stream rush past her cheek, and she understood immediately that the problem was not just the blocked breath gap. The blizzard had sealed the entire outer wall under a skin of packed snow, turning the cabin into a vessel with no exchange. A single slit might let in oxygen but also risked flooding the room with freezing air if she didn't channel it correctly. She moved quickly now, a pattern forming in her mind that hadn't been there before. Using the scissors, she cut a second slit near the top of the quilt on the opposite wall, forcing a slow cross-draft. Cold entering low on the north side, stale, warm air escaping high on the south side. She recalled watching smoke rise from the stovepipe years ago and how the draft pulled best when the top was unobstructed. The physics were the same. Inside 3 minutes, the candle flame stood upright and bright again, and Caleb's breathing deepened. The cabin was colder than it had been 5 minutes earlier, the frost beginning to inch along the bottom edge of the north window glass, but the air was alive again. The invisible killer had been tamed. Over the next 2 days, the blizzard continued to bury the Dakota plains, but Amanda had found the balance point. She checked the candle flame every hour, repositioning the slits slightly when the wind shifted outside. She monitored Caleb's color and his breathing, noting the faint pink that returned to his lips. She kept the stove fed with wood sparingly, aware that she hadn't built the cordwood mountain her neighbors had. But her window quilts, even with the small vents, held the heat inside longer than any bare glass could. By the third morning, she could see a rim of daylight through the outer edges of the north quilt, and she knew the storm was finally loosening its grip. When the sky cleared on January 15th, the temperature sat at 42 below zero, and the world outside was a single continuous sheet of glittering white. In town, the damage was stark. 6 homes had frozen solid during the worst night, their occupants huddled around stoves that couldn't outpace the cold bleeding through the glass. Horace Peck's store had lost an entire front window to frost expansion, the pane splintering inward and letting the deep freeze coat every sack of flour and tin of lard in a heavy rime. At the livery, Margaret Holcomb's husband found 3 horses dead in their stalls, killed not by hunger but by the creeping frostbite that had climbed their legs and bellies while they stood. Across Marshall County, the primary reaction was stunned silence, the kind that follows a war no one expected to fight. And then the stories began to spread. Someone had noticed that the Whitfield cabin, which everyone had called a dark box sewn by a fool, had smoke rising in a straight vertical line from the chimney. No sideways drift, no abandoned hearth. A farmer named Roy Pettigrew, whose own windows were so thickly iced on the inside that he'd had to scrape them with a knife to see out, rode past the Whitfield claim and saw something that stopped him cold. The glass behind the quilted panels, visible at a corner that had shifted, was almost completely clear. He dismounted, walked closer, and confirmed it with his own eyes. Then he rode straight to Horace Peck's store and announced it to a room full of men still digging frozen meat from their own iceboxes. "Woman's got her windows clean as autumn," he said, "and there's life in that house." Horace Peck didn't want to believe it. He built a profitable winter business selling straw-stuffed window pads and double-charge firewood to families who had no other defense against the frost. The idea that a widow with a needle had outperformed every solution he'd ever sold was not just confusing, it was threatening. He scoffed loudly, called it a fluke, and pointed out that no one else who'd followed her advice had gotten results. But that wasn't entirely true. The three women from the sewing circle who had taken Amanda's instructions and hung window quilts in their own homes had also reported clear glass and warmer front rooms. They had just been quiet about it. Now they began whispering to each other, and those whispers moved outward like cracks through ice. Gideon Shale returned 2 days after the blizzard ended, his old mule wearing icicles on her bridle. He didn't come to the door. He circled the cabin slowly, studying the way the snow had drifted against the walls and how the quilts had withstood the wind pressure. He pressed his bare hand against the outer calico, then against the exposed log beside it, and the difference was so pronounced that he frowned deeply. He found Amanda near the woodpile, and for the first time he addressed her not as a curious woman but as an equal. "The ventilation," he said. "You cut those holes during the blow." It wasn't a question. Amanda nodded and told him about the blue flame. Gideon listened without interruption, and when she finished he said simply, "Most folks would have frozen trying to fix what was already broken. You fixed a thing that hadn't broken yet. That's the difference between surviving and dying in this country." Gideon's quiet endorsement carried more weight than he realized. He began to mention the window quilts to men who trusted his judgment: farmers, freighters, a few retired buffalo hunters. Within a week, 6 more families had sent their wives to Amanda's cabin to learn the stitching. The sewing circle grew from 3 to 15 overnight, but with the growing attention came growing resentment from an entirely different quarter. Horace Peck, seeing his winter firewood sales threatened, began spreading a darker rumor. He told customers that the window quilts trapped bad air and would cause sickness, that the Whitfield boy was already weak-lunged because of his mother's unnatural contrivances. Margaret Holcomb, still stung that her warning about dark rooms had been proven hollow, joined him in this line of attack. "A mother who walls her child in darkness is no mother at all," she declared at Sunday social, loud enough for everyone to hear. The tension came to a head on the first mild day of February, when a pair of men, one a county arbitrator, the other a deacon from the Elm Creek Church, arrived at Amanda's door with a formal request. They wanted her to stop teaching the window quilt method. They framed it as a concern for public safety, citing the stale air argument, but Amanda could see the truth. The established order of the town depended on men controlling the means of survival, and her quilts were handing a small piece of that power to women. When she refused to stop, the arbitrator, a thin-faced man named Cyril Barth, told her she would be held responsible if any child in the county took ill from her teaching. The threat was vague but unmistakable. They left her standing in the doorway, the winter light falling across the sewing table behind her where half-finished window covers lay in neat stacks. That night, Amanda sat beside the stove with Caleb asleep in the loft, and she realized that the cold was not her only opponent. The frost could be managed. What couldn't be managed so easily was the fear of men who preferred their women dependent and their winters profitable. She needed to do more than teach sewing. She needed to give women a structure that couldn't be dismantled by intimidation. That was when the idea of the cooperative first took shape in her mind. A self-sustaining circle of women who would not only make window quilts but learn to read, to keep ledgers, to sell their work at fair prices, and to own their decisions collectively. The following Sunday, when the sewing circle met, Amanda did not teach stitching. She placed a slate on the table and began writing the letters of the alphabet. "The quilts keep our children warm," she said, "but words will keep them free." At first the women were uncertain. Some could already read a little, most could not. But they trusted Amanda now because their windows had stayed clear while the town laughed. So they picked up chalk and began. Word of the literacy lessons traveled even faster than the quilts had. Cyril Barth, the arbitrator, heard about it from the deacon's wife, who was horrified that women were learning to write their own names without their husband's permission. Barth saw the cooperative for what it was: a seed that could grow into something uncontrollable. He called a town meeting and proposed a new ordinance that would require any woman teaching or selling goods outside her own home to obtain a permit signed by her husband or nearest male relative. The measure was aimed squarely at Amanda, and everyone knew it. When Gideon Shale learned of the proposal, he rode to the Whitfield cabin and told Amanda plainly, "The men in this town aren't afraid of your quilts, Amanda. They're afraid that if you can stop the frost, you might stop them too." He paused, then added, "And they're right to be afraid, because now you have to decide how far you're willing to carry this." Amanda stood at her window, the one where she'd made the first desperate cut during the blizzard, and looked out at the frozen landscape that had nearly killed her son. The same cold waited outside the homes of every woman in her circle, and the same men who threatened her now would leave those women to freeze for the sake of their own authority. She turned back to Gideon. "They want a permit," she said. "I'll give them something they never expected, a document written and signed by women who own their own labor." She didn't yet know what form that document would take, but the decision itself was a line in the snow. The next morning, she began drafting the articles of what would become the first female cooperative in Marshall County, and the town's resistance, which had started as laughter, was about to become a genuine fight. She wrote the articles on a sheet of butcher paper, the ink made from boiled walnut hulls because the store had stopped selling her ink. Horace Peck had seen to that quietly, refusing to stock any supplies that might reach the Whitfield cabin. But Amanda had learned resourcefulness the hard way, and she drafted the Marshall County Women's Quilting and Literacy Cooperative with precise language that Cyril Barth himself could not fault. The document named 7 founding members, all women, and declared their purpose: to manufacture window quilts for sale at a fair price, to teach reading and writing to any woman who asked, and to share profits equally. No husband's signature was required for membership, a deliberate omission that struck at the heart of Barth's proposed ordinance. The first official meeting took place in the Whitfield cabin on a night so cold that the stars looked like splinters of glass. 15 women attended, arriving in ones and twos to avoid notice, their boots crunching across the frozen yard. They sat on benches made from split logs while Amanda read the articles aloud, her voice steady despite the weight of what they were doing. The youngest was a girl of 17 who had never held a book. The oldest was a grandmother of 60 who had lost 2 sons to winter fever. When the vote came to approve the cooperative, every hand rose. Not one woman hesitated. Margaret Holcomb was not present, but her eldest daughter, Sarah, was, and her hand went up with the rest. The first shipment of cooperative-made window quilts went to 3 homesteads outside Elm Creek, families who had lost everything in the January storm except their lives. The women worked in rotation at Amanda's cabin, stitching layers of calico and wool, while the children practiced letters on slates in the corner. Within 2 weeks, they had produced 41 quilts, and the money from their sale was deposited into a locked tin box buried beneath the cabin floor. For the first time in her life, Amanda Whitfield held $32 that belonged entirely to women, earned by women, controlled by women. The feeling was terrifying and addictive. Cyril Barth learned of the cooperative's existence from a farmer who had purchased a window quilt and boasted of its effectiveness at the Elm Creek feed store. Barth convened an emergency meeting of the town council, a group of 5 men whose combined wealth depended heavily on the winter trade in firewood, coal, and straw insulation. Horace Peck sat at the front, his face mottled red with anger. Barth laid out the threat: a collective of women, teaching other women, taking money that should flow through proper channels, and defying the natural order of a frontier town. The proposed permit ordinance had not yet passed, but Barth now pushed for something faster and harsher: an injunction forbidding any woman from selling goods produced outside her own home without a male sponsor. The council voted in favor, 3-2. The dissenting votes came from a blacksmith who had lost his wife to frostbite and a carpenter whose windows had stayed clear thanks to one of the quilts. The injunction was delivered to Amanda by the town marshal, a tired man named Orville Crane who had known her husband before the accident. He handed her the paper without meeting her eyes. "They're serious about this, Mandy," he said. "Next time it's a fine you can't pay, and after that it's the lockup." Amanda read the injunction slowly, her fingers tracing the words. Then she folded it neatly and placed it on the mantel. "Orville, you've seen my windows. Have you ever seen frost on my glass?" The marshal admitted he had not. "Then you know what I'm doing works, and you know why they want me stopped." He had no answer for that. The cooperative did not disband. Instead, it moved deeper into secrecy. The women met at night in a root cellar beneath the abandoned Gunderson farm, a half-mile from town, where the entrance was hidden by a collapsed wagon. They sewed by candlelight, and the children learned letters on the walls using charcoal. Amanda continued to lead the reading lessons, and by the end of February, 3 of the founding members could write their own names. One of them, a mother of 5 named Esther Lange, used her new literacy to compose a letter to the territorial newspaper in Bismarck, describing the cooperative's work and the town's efforts to suppress it. The letter was published without her surname, but the details were unmistakable to anyone in Marshall County. The letter changed everything. The territorial governor, a reform-minded man named Nehemiah Goss, had been looking for examples of frontier entrepreneurship to promote in the capital. He dispatched a clerk to investigate the Marshall County Cooperative. When the clerk arrived, Barth intercepted him, spinning a story of women led astray by a dangerous widow who trapped children in dark rooms and poisoned the air. But the clerk insisted on visiting the Whitfield cabin. He found a clean, well-lit home, a boy who could read aloud from a primer, and a window quilt that kept the glass behind it frost-free at 18 below zero. He left with a sample quilt and a copy of the cooperative's articles. Horace Peck realized the tide was turning against him, and he decided to make one final push. He approached Gideon Shale with an offer, a share of his winter supply profits if Gideon would publicly denounce the window quilts as unsafe. Gideon listened to the offer in silence, then stood up from his chair and walked out of the store without a word. That same afternoon, he rode to the Whitfield cabin and told Amanda everything. "Peck's scared enough to try buying my silence," Gideon said. "That means he knows he's losing, but scared men do stupid things. Watch your back." Amanda thanked him and asked one favor, that he teach her and the other women how to read the weather the way he read it. Gideon agreed. The next day, he began holding twice-weekly lessons at the root cellar, teaching the women to recognize the signs of an approaching cold front, the meaning of cloud shapes, and the warning stillness that preceded a blizzard. Knowledge that had once been the guarded property of men on the frontier now passed into the hands of women. The test arrived sooner than anyone expected. In the first week of March, after a brief warm spell that had fooled the town into believing spring was near, the temperature plunged 40 degrees in 3 hours. A storm of freezing rain coated every surface with glare ice, followed by a gale that shattered tree limbs and drove the cold through every crack and seam. This was not dry snow driven by wind. This was wet, penetrating cold that found every weakness in a structure. In Elm Creek, 3 houses lost their roofs to the weight of ice. A schoolhouse wall collapsed, killing the teacher. And in the panic that followed, the men who had stocked firewood and straw pads discovered that their supplies were insufficient against a cold that clung and seeped. But the homes with window quilts survived intact. The thick wool batting absorbed the damp without freezing, and the calico outer layers shed the rain before it could soak through. Families who had bought from the cooperative reported that their windows remained frost-free even as the ice storm raged. The evidence became so overwhelming that even Margaret Holcomb broke her silence. She arrived at Amanda's door during the second night of the storm, her own home having lost 2 windows to the freeze, and asked to join the cooperative. Amanda admitted her without a word of reproach. The circle grew again. When the storm passed, the territorial clerk's report had reached Bismarck. Governor Goss issued a statement praising the Marshall County Women's Quilting and Literacy Cooperative as a model of frontier ingenuity, and he recommended that other settlements adopt similar practices. The injunction against the cooperative was quietly withdrawn by the town council, not out of goodwill, but because the political pressure from the capital made further opposition dangerous. Barth resigned his post as arbitrator and left the county within the month. Horace Peck attempted to maintain his business, but the demand for straw pads collapsed as window quilts became the standard in the region. By summer, he had sold his store to a buyer from Fargo and moved east. But the cooperative's victory was not merely about survival or economics. In the months that followed, the women of Marshall County expanded their work into other areas. They began sewing clothing for the poor, teaching arithmetic alongside reading, and establishing a small lending library in the back room of the rebuilt schoolhouse. The window quilt itself became a symbol of something larger, a fabric boundary that had held back not only the winter but an entire way of thinking. And the woman who had first hung calico over a frosty pane stood at the center of it all, no longer a subject of mockery but a quiet force that had bent the shape of her world. Yet the hardest part for Amanda was not the opposition she had overcome. It was the realization, slow and sharp, that her husband John's death had set all of this in motion. If the wagon wheel had held that autumn, if he had come home and chopped the wood and nailed the shutters like every other man, she might never have noticed the frost on the bare window or the strange warmth of a pinned quilt. The tragedy that had broken her had also made her see what others ignored. And standing in the doorway of her cabin on the first warm evening of spring, watching Caleb run through the greening prairie grass, Amanda understood that the cold would always return, but now there were women who would not face it alone. The cooperative's legacy would grow far beyond a single storm season, far beyond a single town. Over the next 2 decades, similar groups formed across Dakota Territory, then into Montana and Wyoming, based directly on the articles Amanda had written on butcher paper with walnut ink. And the women who learned to read in that root cellar went on to become teachers, business owners, and in one case, a territorial legislator. But the moment that truly sealed the cooperative's place in history came on a morning in 1884, when the territorial governor himself rode into Elm Creek to present Amanda Whitfield with a certificate of recognition. He found her in the cabin with a window quilt half finished on the table and a primer open to the letter G. She stood to receive the certificate. And then, without ceremony, she returned to her stitching, because the work was never truly done. And that was the point. The certificate went into a drawer and stayed there, unframed, because Amanda had never needed a governor to tell her what her quilts already proved. By the summer of 1884, the Marshall County Women's Quilting and Literacy Cooperative had grown from 7 founding members to 43, and every new member brought a window that had failed to frost. The tin box beneath the cabin floor now held $210, and the women had voted to use a portion of it to purchase a printing press, secondhand, from a defunct newspaper in Grand Forks. They taught themselves to set type, and by autumn they were publishing a small monthly circular called The Window Quilt, which carried not only patterns and stitching advice, but also primers on civic rights and excerpts from territorial law. It was the first periodical in the county written exclusively by women, and it reached as far as Bismarck and Deadwood. The second winter after the cooperative's founding arrived with a fury that older settlers called the worst since 1868. Temperatures held at 50 below for 6 straight days, and the wind never rested. Snow packed into drifts that covered barn doors and buried wagons up to their axles. In Marshall County, losses were severe. 17 head of cattle froze standing, a freight hauler lost both hands to frostbite, and an elderly couple in a sod house south of Elm Creek was discovered too late, their bodies curled together beneath a single thin blanket. But among the cooperative's member households, the story was different. Not a single window quilt failed. The double-stitched calico held. The wool batting trapped the heat. The breath gaps, now standardized at 3/8 of an inch by cooperative rule, maintained safe airflow even when drifts climbed the outer walls. The quilts had been tested by the worst the plains could offer, and they had held. In the spring of 1885, the territorial legislature passed a Homestead Improvement Act that included a small grant for families who adopted proven cold weather insulation techniques. The cooperative's window quilts were the first method listed in the legislation, described in exact detail with Amanda's name attached. The bill's sponsor, a representative from Pembina, had read the window quilt after his own wife subscribed, and he'd seen the difference in their farmhouse. When the act passed, Amanda was invited to Bismarck to demonstrate the quilting technique before the assembly. She traveled by wagon with Esther Lange and Sarah Holcomb, the latter now a fully literate member of the cooperative despite her mother's early hostility. They set up a quilting frame in the Capitol's antechamber and worked while lawmakers walked through, asking questions. One old rancher, a man who'd spent 40 years on the frontier, pressed his hand against the finished quilt and felt the warmth trapped inside, then shook his head slowly. "My mother could have used this," he said. "She died of lung fever in a cabin with ice on the inside walls." No one laughed at window bedding anymore. The cooperative's influence rippled outward in ways Amanda had not predicted. Other towns formed their own circles, often modeling their charters directly on the one she'd written in walnut ink. A women's cooperative in Cheyenne built an entire textile mill around the window quilt design, shipping orders as far east as Chicago. In Helena, a former member of the Marshall County Circle opened a school that taught reading, arithmetic, and domestic science to girls who had never been allowed inside a classroom. Amanda's name appeared in territorial newspapers, and strangers sometimes wrote to her asking for patterns or advice. She answered every letter, often enclosing a square of calico or wool batting as a sample, and Caleb, now 12, helped carry the mail to the Elm Creek post office. But the change that mattered most to Amanda was the one she saw every day inside her own home. The boy who had nearly suffocated during the blizzard of '83 had grown tall and strong, his lungs clear, his appetite sharp. He could read fluently, write a steady hand, and calculate board feet of lumber in his head. He'd learned weather signs from Gideon Shale and could predict a cold snap by the shape of the clouds and the way the smoke curled from the chimney. Amanda had given him warmth, yes, but she'd also given him the tools to understand the world that had nearly killed them. That, she believed, was the real inheritance. Gideon Shale died in the autumn of 1885, not from cold but from an infection that set in after a mule kick shattered his shin. He was buried on a low hill overlooking the basin he'd traveled for decades, and at his funeral, Amanda read aloud from a letter he dictated to Esther Lange only a month before. "The cold is a teacher," Gideon had written. "Most folks treat it like an enemy and spend their lives fighting it, but the ones who listen to what the cold is actually saying, they're the ones who outlast it." Amanda Whitfield listened, and she taught others to listen. That's a bigger thing than any man's firewood. The letter became a kind of founding document for the cooperative's second generation, a reminder that the quilt was not a weapon against winter but a conversation with it. But the most startling detail of the cooperative's legacy did not emerge until the spring of 1890, when Caleb Whitfield, now 17 and working as an apprentice surveyor for the territory, was cleaning out the old root cellar beneath the Gunderson farm. The space had been abandoned years earlier after the cooperative moved its meetings to the new schoolhouse, and the entrance had collapsed again, this time from a heavy rain. Caleb and two other boys dug it out, and in the process they uncovered a small wooden chest that had been buried beneath the dirt floor. Inside were the original charter articles, still legible despite the damp, along with Amanda's first sewing scissors, a spool of thread, and a stack of letters from women who had joined the cooperative in its earliest days. The letters were remarkable for what they revealed: women writing in uncertain hands, some still learning to form letters, describing the fear they had felt defying their husbands, the cold they had endured before the quilts, and the quiet pride of seeing their own children learn to read. One letter, from a woman named Cora Hess, ended with a line that Caleb carried in his pocket for the rest of his life. "I used to think the winter was stronger than me. Now I know I am stronger than the winter, because I understand what it is." The discovery of the chest changed how the cooperative remembered itself. The documents were taken to the Territorial Archives in Bismarck, where they were preserved as evidence of the first organized women's labor association in Dakota Territory. Amanda, then 46 and still sewing, was interviewed by a historian from the state university, who noted that the window quilt's design, 3 layers, dead air trapping, moisture-shedding outer face, anticipated by several decades the principles of modern home insulation that would not be formally described by building scientists until the 1920s. The historian called it frontier thermodynamics, and Amanda, when told of the phrase, smiled and said, "I just noticed where the frost didn't grow." The cooperative continued to operate until the First World War, when many of its members' sons were drafted and the focus shifted to producing blankets and clothing for the war effort. By that time, more than 2,000 women had passed through its doors, learning to sew, to read, to manage money, and to argue for their own interests in public forums. 3 of the women who had sat in the Whitfield cabin on that first night went on to hold elected office in the state legislature after North Dakota achieved statehood in 1889. Sarah Holcomb became the county school superintendent, a position that gave her authority over the very schoolhouse where her mother had once warned Amanda about dark rooms and sick children. The irony was not lost on anyone, and the window quilts themselves. They became so common that no one thought of them as strange anymore. Every hardware store in the Dakotas carried them in winter, factory-made versions that lacked the careful hand-stitching of the originals, but kept the basic principle. Home insurers began offering small discounts to policyholders who installed quilts, and the university's Agricultural Extension Service published a bulletin with diagrams of Amanda's design, crediting her by name. The frost no longer bloomed inside Dakotan windows, and a generation of children grew up never knowing the sight of ice on the inside of a bedroom pane. But for all the institutional success, the moment that Amanda Whitfield herself considered the truest victory came quietly, on a cold afternoon in February of 1895. She was walking through Elm Creek when she passed the lot where Horace Peck's store had once stood. The building was gone, replaced by a small lending library funded by the county, and inside, a young girl sat at a table reading aloud from a book while a librarian looked on. The girl was 8, maybe 9, and she read without hesitation, her voice carrying out through the half-open door. Amanda stopped on the boardwalk and listened. She did not go inside, did not announce herself. She simply stood there, letting the sound wash over her, a sound that had once been impossible in this town. Then she walked home, sat down at her sewing table, and began a new quilt. She was still stitching when the sun went down. Was Amanda Whitfield a genius? Or was she simply a woman who refused to look away from a patch of clear glass until she understood why it was clear? The answer may not matter. What matters is that when the cold came for her family, she did not fight it with brute force like the men stacking cordwood. She studied it, learned its language, and taught it to break around her. And in doing so, she taught an entire generation of women that the deadliest force on the frontier was not the winter itself, but the belief that nothing could be done about it. The frost never stood a chance. In the decades after her death in 1904, the window quilts Amanda Whitfield stitched became so ordinary that people stopped asking where they came from. They hung in farmhouses across the Dakotas and Montana, in miners' cabins in the Rockies, in the sod homes of Nebraska homesteaders who had never heard the name Whitfield. The quilts became, quite simply, what you did to keep the frost off your windows. But buried in that ordinariness was a radical truth. The coldest place on the frontier had been tamed not by engineers or merchants, but by a woman with a needle, some calico scraps, and the stubborn belief that a solution must exist because frost never formed where fabric touched glass. The physics Amanda discovered by observation are now standard building science. Modern window insulation still relies on the same dead air gaps she created with wool batting, and the ventilation slits she improvised during the blizzard are echoed in every modern home's passive airflow design. But the larger legacy of the Marshall County Women's Quilting and Literacy Cooperative was not technical. It was the proof that survival on the frontier did not always belong to the strongest, the richest, or the loudest. Sometimes it belonged to the most observant. The women who learned to read in that root cellar went on to teach hundreds more, and the simple act of writing their own names became the first crack in a wall much harder than frost. But there is a detail about Amanda that the historical record almost missed. When the territorial archivist cataloged the documents found in the Gunderson root cellar, he noted that the original charter of the cooperative was written on the back of a letter Amanda had received a year earlier from the Elm Creek Town Council, denying her the right to sell her quilts without a male sponsor. She had not thrown that letter away. She had used it as raw material, turning rejection into the foundation of something the council could not stop. That single sheet of paper contained both the attempt to silence her and the instrument of its own defeat. Perhaps that was the only fitting monument she ever needed. What drove a woman who had lost everything to trust in fabric against 40 below wind? Was Amanda Whitfield a solitary genius, or was she simply one of the few people in her time willing to look at a clear pane of glass and ask why? The question lingers because it matters for everyone who has ever faced a problem that seemed too large, too cold, too inevitable. Sometimes the solution does not require more force. It requires a different kind of attention. If you want to discover more stories of ordinary people who changed their world against all odds, subscribe now and become part of a community that believes history is not just what happened, it's what we learn to see. Thank you for watching.